I would say that it was almost a full month before anything else strange occurred in Morton, but if you know this place, then you'll know already that this would be a lie. What I can say is that it was a full month before anything linked to these other two incidents took place, and a month before anything else strange happened to me. By that time, the term had restarted, I was back teaching history at Morton High School, and I had tried in the meantime to put the memory of Jackie's mournful face and Claudette's wide-eyed glare from my mind, though I'll gladly admit that was not an easy thing to do. During the daytime, when I was preoccupied with classes, detentions and marking, the thoughts were kept at bay, superseded by the immediate task to hand. At other times, though, they were far less subdued. When, for example, I left work for the day and would trudge up the stone steps and past the old church, I couldn't help but think back to that night. The nativity display had long since been removed, but the building, large and imposing, and the small approach area in front of it was still very much there. One thing that was not there, or at least which had been notably absent, was Claudette. Usually she was to be found pottering about outside the grounds, especially in the hours after school let out when, to be honest, I always suspected her of deliberately busying herself outside so that she could say hello and share pleasantries with the kids and staff as they left for the day. In all the years prior to that strange night with the nativity, I had seen her almost every day after school and often stopped for a brief chat if I wasn't in a rush to get somewhere. Since that night just after Christmas, though, I'd seen neither hide nor hair of her. Clearly she was still around, because if the church services or building maintenance had ground to a halt, the school would have known about it. Perhaps, I thought, she had taken the wise step of retreating from the cold and staying inside these days. Of course, that had never been the case in the past, and honestly, I could not stifle the feeling that perhaps Claudette was only inside because she was scared and hiding from something. That idea, when crossing that lonely stretch of land long after everyone else had gone, was not a comforting thought. This being January in the north of England, winter was still very much with us, which meant that the darkness was too. By the time I finished my classes at 3:30 and either sat through detention duty or ran one of the extracurricular activities, it would already be 4:45 p.m. Add on an hour of marking at my desk and I was leaving work closer to 6, by which time the sun had not only already set but vanished entirely. Outside the window, the sky was black and the air frigid, which meant that the walk up to the church was exactly as it had been that night, save for the fact there were probably fewer lights in this post-Christmas gloom. On the way up the hill, walking invariably through ice and snow that had been shoveled aside but had treacherously refrozen after hundreds of kids' shoes had turned it to watery grey slush, I tried to convince myself that I wouldn't feel scared. Not only was there nothing up there to worry about, but there had been nothing that night either. I told myself that I wouldn't think about Jackie's strange story of the woman with hands for feet, standing and silently watching from the garden. But of course I did. Reaching the top of the steps, I would scurry hurriedly across the approach, trying as best as I could to maintain my balance on the slippery surface, whilst all the while feeling, in a way I couldn't quite put my finger on, the presence of another somewhere behind me. The approach up the church was fringed with trees, and in the spring and summer made for a pretty and tranquil walk up. In the winter, however, when the bare-branched carcasses of trees stood like the naked bones of seasons past, the entire area had a somber, eerie feeling about it, long before you threw terrified church attendants or hand-footed women into the mix. So I did think about those things, and with my collar turned up and coat wrapped around me, I hurried through the space with as much speed as I could. On one occasion, about 3 weeks after the incident with the Christmas manger, I was stopped in my tracks by a sound. The crack and snap of branches somewhere to my left. I stopped stock still and stared into the space I believed the sound to have come from. Nothing moved. The trees stared back, silent and blameless. Still, I thought there had been something. A sound, movement from that very spot. As I took one careful step toward the tree line, something touched my shoulder. Spinning around with such speed that I almost lost my footing and slipped to the ground on the ice, I caught sight of Claudette. Somehow, with a level of stealth that a leopard would be in awe of, she had crept up behind me and had decided, rather than simply saying hello, she should reach out and grab my shoulder, scaring the absolute living shit out of me in the process. Jesus Christ! I shouted as I turned. To my surprise, rather than being apologetic for scaring me half out of my wits, Claudette lashed out and slapped me on the chest.
"Don't blaspheme!" she admonished, forgetting in the process that only a few weeks earlier I had found her screaming exactly the same words to anyone who would listen. Maybe it's not sacrilege when you're genuinely praying for your life. "Good God, you scared the hell out of me!" Another slap, lighter this time, but again across the chest.
"Don't blaspheme!"
she repeated. The blow from such a small and elderly woman should not really have been painful and yet seemed sharp, angular, and unexpectedly hard. What made the slap more impactful was the enormous number of rosary beads she had wrapped around her hands. Not just her hands either. A quick glance revealed that she had at least 24 full sets of rosary's beads, each with rows of polished beads and small metal crucifix wrapped tightly around her hands, wrist and forearms. There were another 9 or 10 sets around her neck. She looked like a cross between the shaman of some strange offshoot Christian sect and a lunatic. Whilst the collection of beads around the neck looked uncomfortable enough, the sets on her arms and wrists looked positively painful, wound so tightly and wrapped over each other in such tangles that the skin below looked bruised, abraded and sore. For a second I thought that perhaps she was wearing the beads as some kind of devotional act, similar to how monks would wear an uncomfortable hair shirt or flagellate as atonement for sins. After a moment, however, it dawned on me that she was wearing them as amulets. They were meant for protection.
"I just wanted to tell you."
She began looking around to check that no one else was listening, despite the fact that we couldn't have possibly been more alone.
"I haven't seen that thing properly since the wolf, but there is something up here at night. I saw a shadow moving about up here a few days back. At first I thought it was the priest, but it was massive. Twice the size of him, and he's a pretty big fella. Anyway, I was inside looking out through one of the windows, and this shape, just a big black mess it was. Sort of a blank, if that makes sense, like no features, no clothes, nothing, just all black and slick or wet, like it was made of ink or crude oil or something. Well, it was stalking about the place, sniffing here and there. I must have watched it for 5 minutes before it just slunk off back into the woods. It wasn't a wolf, not this time, but I know evil when I see it. Maybe it was a demon or a foul spirit or something, like the ones you read about in the Bible. Wherever it wasn't a person.
Having managed to slow my heart rate back to something approaching normal and feeling my feet harden into blocks of ice, I nodded to Claudette and tried to make my excuses. The werewolf incident had been unnerving, but these tales of shadow people and weird ink monsters were not only stretching credulity, but becoming a bit wearisome, not to mention freezing.
"Well, if you see anything like that again, don't come out. See if you can get it on film and call the police. Hopefully they'll be able to catch it or something."
Claudette shook her head derisively.
"I told the police. I rang them as soon as I knew the thing was gone. I even went outside to see if there were footprints, so I could show them where it had been. You know, like tracks in the snow or whatever."
"And were there?" I asked.
"No,"
she muttered quietly.
"only handprints. Finger marks all over the floor as if it had been walking upside down or, I don't know, like it had hands for feet."
If I had not already been cold, I certainly would have been then, because hearing those words sent needles of frost through my veins. How could she know that story? How could she have heard what Jackie had told us weeks earlier? Perhaps I thought one of the old blokes in the pub knew her. Maybe Diane was a devout churchgoer on the side and had let slip during some casual conversation, relating Jackie's story secondhand and allowing Claudette to incorporate this scarily familiar detail into her own fanciful tales. I pictured Diane with tattoos, missing teeth, and a mouth almost as filthy as the bar towel she used every night but never seemed to wash, and disregarded the idea. I doubted she'd ever been inside a church in her life. I knew the guys wouldn't be running off to tell people, especially since Jackie was so upset about it. So how had that idea, that hideous little detail, managed to get into both? It was, it seemed to me, far too great a coincidence. Suddenly, the creepy stories had stopped being just unnerving and turned instead into something urgent. For whilst we might have been alone at that time of the evening, this was still a public place. A place frequented in daylight hours by children making their way backward and forwards to school. Do me a favour, okay, Claudette? I'm going to speak to a few people about this. Until then, try not to come out after dark. Whatever this thing is, you've only seen at night so far, so we can assume it's nocturnal. Stay inside, lock the doors, and hopefully we'll catch whatever it is before it has a chance to do any damage. Claudette took a step back and scrutinised me as if trying to read some great truth in my face. When she spoke again, her words came out in croaks as she fought to hold back tears.
You believe me? You don't think I'm just a mad old churchwoman?
I shook my head and tried to smile. You're not mad, Claudette. Annoying, maybe. Claudette smiled and snorted a laugh through her tears. I'm not sure what to believe, but I certainly don't think you'd lie to me, and that's enough to get me worried. So please go inside and lock the doors. Claudette nodded and scurried off back toward the sacristy. As she reached the door, she turned, calling back that she would pray for me. As she finally closed the door and I realised that I was once again left to make the journey alone, I realised that she probably meant it. She probably would pray for me, which was a good thing, because in the weeks to come I would need all the help I could get.